Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, uh, Ralph. And thank you everyone for being here. Welcome to tonight's workshop at the Norwalk Board of Education. It's Tuesday, May 3rd. With us tonight, we have myself, Colin Hostin. We have board members Mary Ellen Flaherty Ludwig, Diana Carpio, Godfrey Azima, Janine Randolph, Erica De Palma, and I think I saw, yeah, there's Sherry Brown. I think I got all the board members present. We're also joined by our district superintendent, Dr. Estrella, and many members of her cabinet. And we're going to start tonight off with our Pledge of Allegiance, which I believe we have some help with.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
And sincere thanks to Alan Portoviejo and Carissa Hunter from West Rocks Middle School. Okay, so tonight's workshop is actually usually one of my favorites of the year. Tonight we have our annual School Governance Council Co-Chair Forum. And to get us started, I'm going to ask Dr. Estrella to introduce us to what we're going to be doing tonight.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think, like the chairman articulated, this is one of the best workshops that we have throughout the year because it gives us an opportunity to engage our SGCs and inquire what things are working well throughout our organization and what are things that we can continue to work collaboratively in improving and strengthening as a team. So today we are going to start off the day first by going back to the work that has been utilized to set the path forward this year, particularly after we completed our strategic plan. We have set priorities. I'm just going to ask Ralph to put those up for a quick second.
And sorry to interrupt, Dr. Estrella, just really quick. I didn't see Cheryl Harris is also here. And Ralph, do you see that message from Kara? She's also here. Thank you.
Okay. So as I was saying, we have set our work grounded on the 5 priorities that were designed through the task force and a number of community conversations and different constituent engagements that took place last year. The priorities that we are emphasizing as a result of a strategic plan are focused around future readiness, equity, excellence, engagement, and most importantly, making sure that high quality instruction and support is provided to all of our students across the organization, regardless of what scaffolds or supports that they need. And as we immerse ourselves in the conversation today, I think it's important for us to kind of go back and reflect on these priorities, because these priorities are the guiding tools that we have been utilizing to inform our goals for this year, and also to inform the practices that we're emphasizing and focusing as an organization at large. With that, we through these priorities, we've also talked about how to further extend partnerships that will help us yield the best possible future-ready areas of focus for our students, so that those students that wish to continue their education either in a college path, certification, or a workforce embedded practice, they have those opportunities, because as we immerse ourselves in continuous improvement and development of the work that we do, we always grounded on these elements that are focused around their development and ensuring that they have all the tools necessary to be successful within our community and our globe at large. Today we have Dr. Richard Lemons, who will be joining us as our facilitator in this work and supporting us through the conversation. But before we go into our groups, one of the things that it's important for us to engage in is conversations around the school-based budgeting process, particularly because this is something that most of our schools are going to start working on within the next week or two. So our CFO, Lunda Asmani, will be joining us today to provide us with an overview of where we are in the budget process, some of the outcomes that resulted through our advocacy to finalize our budget, and then most importantly, the SPB process that many of you will engage in within the next few days. So I'm first going to turn it over to Ms. Brenda Wilcox-William, who has helped organize this evening's event, and allow her to just give a broader scope of the work this evening, and then she'll turn it over to the other members of the team that will be supporting the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Estrella. Good evening, everyone. As the superintendent mentioned, we will be starting with Mr. Asmani and the student-based budgeting presentation. And then we will be asking you to move to a second link so that Mr. Lemons can walk you through the feedback session, and we will go into breakout rooms at that time and ask you all to share out information about your own SGC operations, what has worked well, what you're looking to work on in the following year coming up, and then he will give you the opportunity to share out so that the board can ask questions and get your feedback directly from you. So after this initial one is finished, we will ask you to log off and go into the second link that we sent you earlier today, and that way we'll be able to go into breakout sessions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our CFO, Lunda Asmani.
Thank you, Brenda. All right, let us try this piece here. Ralph, are you seeing the slide yet?
No, Linda, we're actually seeing your file structure. Can you just take down the share and do the same thing you did last time?
Okay. Stop share.
Yes, when you hit slideshow, Linda, just change the display settings at the top. Go to slideshow.
Oh, I see.
Sorry about that.
Start. Share.
Yeah, and there's just go right there. Just go to the top where it says display. Yep, mirror it.
Display settings, and are you seeing it?
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect. All right, that was exciting. So thank you. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just going over the SPB process and the budget. So I'll kind of go back track and just provide a high-level overview of our budget development process over here at the Board of Ed. from the time we start the initial conversations all the way to the end when the Board of Ed makes the final approval. So we begin the process. We have 5 levels of budget development. The first one is what we call the pro forma. This is usually in late November, early December, which is really the starting point. We look at the budget that's been approved. We start doing preliminary analysis of the staffing that we have. We estimate for any wage increases that are in the collective bargaining agreements. We have some initial conversations about health insurance costs and what's been forecasted and what we know. So we put all of those numbers together initially. And then we send this to the departments initially, not the schools, but just the other departments within the district to kind of start building this budget together. And so we have those numbers. We have preliminary assumptions based on enrollment of what the school budgets will be. So we go through that process, and then the superintendent makes the superintendent's budget recommendation as part of the second phase of budget development. And then we have conversations with the Board of Ed, at which point the Board of Ed approves a tentative approved budget, which then goes to the city and becomes part of the city budget development process. As you know, the Board of Ed is essentially a department of the city in terms of budget development. So we were combined pool of resources to go through the budget process. That's when we have public hearings, conversations with the Board of Estimates and Taxation, the Common Council Finance Committee. We also have joint Board of Ed Finance Committee and Common Council Finance Committee. This is something we started doing recently, and we go through that process. And then as the city budget process gets to an end, they approve the budget. In this instance, this process actually ended yesterday. Last night, the Board of Estimate and Taxation set the final budget, they set the mill rate, and at that point, we know what our allocated budget is. In most years, just as it is this year, what we request is typically not what is funded in the end. And therefore, what happens and what we're going to be working now over the next couple of weeks is a process that we call reconciliation, which is basically looking at what we had initially requested, what has been approved, and how do we make that work. So that happens during this time, and then in June, the Board of Ed will approve the final budget, which becomes effective July 1, and we start management of that budget and providing services for the schools and to our children. So those are essentially the 5 levels of the budget process. The SGC and the schools work closely together in between level 4 and level 5, and that's where we are now. And so over the next couple of weeks, we'll be having those discussions. So just by way of overview, where is our budget? Last year's budget is usually the beginning point, and therefore you see here that the 21-22 approved budget was a little over 208 million. This year, the Board of Ed approved a tentative budget, which was our request to the city when we separated in 3 buckets. We had what we refer to as the base budget increase, which was about 9.3 million, 4.5%, which would fund our school-based budgets and all of the other operational budgets. Included in this number, as I said earlier, were assumptions on things that were unknown at the time, like health insurance. We have assumptions for health insurance, what those are going to be. We've actually gotten those health insurance numbers now, and to the extent that those numbers vary from what we had budgeted during this time of reconciliation and working on the school-based budget, we make those assumptions. This year, as we've shared, we are also looking with the development of the South Norwalk School, is having what we call the Sono Incubator Neighborhood School Incubator. That request was about 1.8 million. We had included that in the base budget request. It wasn't funded in the base, but we're having ongoing conversations with the mayor and the Common Council and the Board of Estimates. We had one meeting this morning as well. And so we are working on funding of that 1.8 million. And then we had also included 7.7 million, which was basically just making us whole for using some of the ESSER funds, but that's a conversation that we'll carry into next year. But this is essentially what our tentative approved budget looks like. It is nice that at least the base budget was funded at that 4.5%, which was what we had requested. We do have some challenges with health insurance going above what we had initially estimated for that number to the tune of about 2.2, 2.3 million or so. But we're working to get that resolved as well. So in terms of what does the budget cover, in addition to the local budget, or what we call the tax dollar funded portion of the budget, which is that 227, we do have about 7.3 million, which is our food services fund, which funds our food services operation. And then we are fortunate to be recipient of quite a number of grants. This year, especially with COVID and some of the ESSER funds from the federal government, our grant budget was about 45 million. And therefore our total budget, all things included, is 280 million, all of those funds combined. And as we talk about the school-based budgets, we will have some additional conversations about the grants. So I'm not going to go over this again, but obviously the superintendent shared about our strategic plan and strategic priorities. That is kind of our compass that guides where we go. And as you work with schools, as the school governance councils, is to ensure that our budgets are consistent with our strategic priorities. And we will continue to work together on that. In terms of how the funds are spent, I'm going to skip over this slide and spend more time on this other slide, is just looking at that overall piece of the budget. Where are these dollars spent? 85% of our budget actually is directly for classroom and school services, which includes student support, our educators, instructional support staff, our busing program. Obviously, we need to get our kids to school, counseling services. That is the bulk of what we do. And about 85% of our budget is related to that section. Business services, obviously, information technology, human resources, legal, accounting, payroll. This is the supporting mechanism that allows everything else to function. Especially now, we've known recently, we have been good at leveraging technology. We are a one-to-one district, which means every student has their own piece of technology and we do not share, which is great. And that is what really allowed us to get through the past 2 years of remote learning. And therefore, there is a considerable piece of one of our priorities is to ensure that we continue to leverage technology in delivery of quality education. And then obviously we have a lot of buildings that require maintenance to ensure that we have functional and safe environment for students to learn. So that's a chunk of that. Professional development, obviously our instructional support, curriculum instructions, equity and training on things like bias and so forth is a huge component also. And then we have general administration of the district, which is actually the smallest component of the budget at about 1.5%. But essentially that's big picture overview of where we spend our resources. In terms of where our staffing, as I mentioned before, we are about 85% of our budget is staff related. We are a people business and extremely heavy focused on personnel. But in terms of distribution, where are our personnel? Obviously, as you can imagine, because we have more elementary schools than any other schools, the majority of our personnel are concentrated in our elementary schools, followed by our 4 high schools, middle schools, and so forth, and facilities and central office. But by far, our biggest staffing drivers are our schools combined. Elementary, high school, and middle accounts for about 80%, 85% of our overall workforce. In terms of what your role in budget development and in working with your principals, it is a partnership between the SGC and the principal. There is shared responsibility. I was fortunate to have served as an SGC member at PTEC, and therefore I understand the role and the responsibility that all of you SGC members have. But it is an integral piece to local school decision-making because you are the ears and you are the parents. And so you do bring a unique perspective in the decision-making. I think what is also important is as you're going through this process with your principals and other administrators is the goal is to help the schools achieve the mission and the vision. And as you go through this process, you will be reviewing the school's mission and vision. How does that align with the overall 5 strategic priorities of the district? As SGC members, you serve as an advisory capacity to advise the principals and the school district. You review things with them, brainstorming, trying to figure out creative ways to provide the quality services. So I'm going to shift to what is a school-based budget. A school-based budget is actually a funding system where the dollars follow the students. We allocate dollars instead of staff or materials. The allocation method, as you'll begin to see once you start working, is based on the number of students enrolled in your schools. But it is a way that allows us to increase. One, it's an equitable way of spending our dollars on the students. It does offer a lot of transparency. And school-based budget do give principals and SGCs some flexibility in how they deliver services, obviously within the confines of the greater mission and vision and strategic priority of the district. And so I think as you're working through with your principals and other administrators in the budget process and your SGC teams is understanding what does this final decision mean in terms of the people spending, and how do these decisions that we make at the school level impact student achievement? Because in the end, that is what we're seeking to achieve. In school-based budget, the dollars follow the student. There are a couple of principles. It is student-focused. As I mentioned, it's equitable. It is differentiated because it does allocate resources based on the student needs. We'll talk about students having different needs. Some are multilingual learners, some have additional needs in terms of their education because students are at different levels of development. And therefore, the student-based budget allows us to differentiate that and to provide equitable ways of funding. And obviously, it does empower schools to decide how to allocate their resources. And as we shared, it is a transparent process of allowing the budgets. As you work with your schools, you will be reviewing school improvement plans that the principals and the school's leadership and staff have worked hard to develop. And I think what's critical is as you're going through the budget process and allocating these funds is ensuring that there is alignment between your improvement plans and the decisions you're making at the budget level. Things that we include is, ensuring that the vision statement and mission statement truly reflect what it is that's happening in the building, understanding student population and the data. Our population is shifting. The needs of our students are changing. And as I mentioned, they're differentiated. They're not the same. So I think having a good understanding of that is also important. And we'll talk about magnet funding because some of our schools do provide magnet programming. And there is a process where we've allocated magnet dollars to fund those schools' operations. So that becomes part of the mix of funding for the schools. Think in terms of what are the funding sources that you have available at the schools. As a total budget, we talked about the local component of the school-based budget. We do have some magnet dollars that are distributed district-wide. Many of our schools have partnerships. We've talked about the Horizon grants, technology grants, and foundation grants that also allow us to provide these services. We have grants from state and local government. We do provide some fee-based programs. Also, you think of our early childhood program where we pay for those services. And then we also get some reimbursements for services that we provide, medical services, we get Medicaid reimbursement and so forth. So we have multiple funding sources that provide funding for our schools. As you look at your student-based budgets, a couple of things that you would look at are central office support teams, business and finance, transportation. We'll talk about multilingual learner funding. This year, we changed and shifted how we fund MLL students in our district. Prior to this year, this used to be centrally funded. This year, we've moved that to the student-based budget. Again, giving schools and school administration and SGCs a bit more flexibility, but also a more equitable way of funding these services. And next year, we will provide even additional flexibility by rolling in special education as part of the school-based budget. So again, you do have some flexibility in terms of how you spend, posting for positions, ensuring that the mission and the theme of the school is considered, stipends, extracurricular activities, and those types of things are all things that come into play. And we talked about some additional items that we've added over the past 5 years, arts and music teachers, counselors, security guards. We're working on libraries and library books. And so those are all things that are factored in and are components of the SPB. So in terms of the process and the assumptions, we will be sending out SPB budgets later this week, early next week at the latest. But then at that point, the principals and other school-based staff will start reviewing this. When we have those meetings with the principals, finance is involved, our human resource is involved, our cabinet is involved, our curriculum team is involved. So it is truly a team effort in ensuring that we provide a wholesome approach to the process and to the budget development. So briefly, I talked about magnet funding. This year, we did go through a process of allocating, as we've done in the past couple of years, magnet funding. So as you meet with your schools, you will see this list again, but I just provide an overview that this year we did allocate a little over $1 million directly to schools to fund some of their magnet programs. It does not meet all of the needs and all of the requests. As you can see this year, we had almost $2 million in requests, but due to funding constraints, we were only able to fund about 50% of that. But again, as we work on the school-based budget, those are some additional resources that we have. We'll also be exploring grants and foundation funding to at least meet some of those needs. So as I wrap up, I'd like to talk briefly about where we are on the base per pupil spending. Last year, we averaged at about $8,500, $8,700. High school, middle school, and elementary schools have different per pupil rates, just based on the nature of services and the needs at each of those levels. This year, we are incorporating MLL into the school-based funding, and therefore we will see some increases just based on that allocation. So what this chart looks at is at the elementary school level, we've listed the different schools and what the total per pupil is this fiscal year. For the elementary schools and the middle schools and the high schools, again, these are different levels just based on the nature and what it takes to educate at these different levels within the school. So as I wrap up, some of the key dates that are coming up, as I shared yesterday, the BET did adopt the final budget for the fiscal year. The week of May 2nd, which is this week or early next week, we will start sending out SPB packages to principals, and they will begin work with you. So there'll be a 2-week period where the principals and the SGCs will work to develop their school-based budget. And then the week of May 17th through May 26th, we will have SPB meetings with the schools and the team in central office that I mentioned earlier. We are scheduled to have the Board of Ed adopt the budgets June 14th, ready for July 1 start. So some of the discussion that you'll be having with SPB are positions, changes and additions, looking at enrollment data, grades, sections, class sizes, talking about new programs or new projects, ideas in terms of fundraisings, and I mentioned grants and other opportunities. This year, we are also looking at equitably funding counselors within your schools, and also emphasis for schools that don't have library and media specialists. We'll be encouraging that to be part of the SPB, and we will have discussions with the principals and the SGCs as we go through this process. So that kind of concludes what I had to say. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, and let me stop my screen share at this time. But I'm happy to answer questions at this time, and thank you for your attention.
Great.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So, how is this impacted if you have in a particular building and I'm thinking probably an elementary PTO, who decides that they, maybe they have a couple of parents who work in a company and they want to do something specific for that building. Maybe they want to upgrade the technology, or there's some other specific program that they want to do as an extra for that building. So, how does that then impact the other schools? Wouldn't that kind of interfere with the equity part of it, or no? Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I understand totally what you're saying, and we have Dr. Case and some former principals on the call that can speak to it. From a finance perspective, the first thing that we look at, and I've had these conversations with the principals, is depending on what they're trying to do, is it already included in the plan for the schools? If you want to renovate the library, or you want whatever it is, whatever improvement you'd like to do at the facility, the first thing we do is it already in the plan, and is there already funding for that? And the reason we do that is if it is, then you could divert those resources towards something else. But in terms of equity, does that lead to some inequities because some PTOs may be better funded than others? I don't know, I'll defer to my colleagues on the call if they have a perspective to share on that.
I think the most important thing, Sherry, with us is looking at what are the resources that different schools have, taking into account additional resources that communities can bring in. I think a perfect example of that is when we looked at the Verizon grant and what it afforded 3 of our schools, and what we could do budgetarily to then support other school, like for instance, the one school that didn't get the resources in the district. So we're always carefully monitoring what additional resources come in and making sure that not only all the schools have the fundamental elements to ensure their success, but also that we, where possible, are building resources to meet the needs of different communities, because every school doesn't need exactly the same thing. And I think a lot of people confuse the concept of equality with equity. And because of that, people assume that every organization within, or every school within the organization needs to have exactly the same thing. And that's not always necessarily the case, because in the same fashion that every school has different themes or areas of focus, they also have different priorities and need. And we try to, as we look at the budget, keep that in mind to make sure that schools have the resources that they need to serve the populations that they're serving. Another example of that is how we're looking at the infusion of resources to support multilingual learners, and making sure that the budgets, the SBB budget has that incorporated. And it's something that we're also looking next year to have our special education programs funded through the SBB process instead of having a separate allocation as well.
Yeah, I know the district would make sure that it was equitable. I was just using technology as an example. I'm just talking about, like, if you just had a very well-funded PTO, say Merrimack, and they wanted to maybe do some special MLL program, or they really wanted to put an extensive group of books in the library or something, and then the other schools didn't have that. I'm thinking more of that. I mean, I know that if the district does something like with the Verizon, I know that there's definitely going to be efforts to make sure that that's equitable. I'm talking about, in just a building where, they're not going to, the particular parent group is not necessarily going to make sure that the other schools, have access to that. So I was just thinking in those terms.
No, and I understand your concern, and that's why even with Title I dollars, it provides additional resources for schools that might have students of lower socioeconomic demographics, and that affords those particular schools opportunities to bring in additional programs that otherwise they would not. And we also centrally keep careful tabs in terms of the resources, either public or private, coming into schools so that we ensure that if we have philanthropic dollars or additional resources of that nature, we can utilize those funds to kind of level the playing field when we have instances where there are certain schools that are better resourced than others. I think Mary Ellen has a question.
Thank you, Sherry. Mary Ellen, I see your hand.
Yes, Linda, when you mentioned MLL funding, you said the formula is being tinkered with maybe, or what I'm just interested straight out is does an MLL student get a higher number of dollars sent their way?
Do you want me to start and you interject, or?
Go ahead, Alex. The answer is yes, but yes, go ahead, Alex.
And then how does that happen? You know.
So one of the things that we have been extensively working, Mary Ellen, this year is really looking at what is the best formula to utilize to effectively serve our multilingual learners. Particularly starting off with service hours, because one of the things that we've had to do is really revamp the number of hours being provided so that it aligned with research-based practices. Because across the organization, we had areas of improvement that we wanted to address. And that was the first thing. Francis Sayas, who's not here with us, has been instrumental in working with Mr. Asmani around this particular component. So once we identified the number of service hours required, what that meant in terms of personnel to support the program, we then calculated more or less how much would that cost per pupil, and then built the additional percentage per child depending on the type of intervention they needed, because depending on the level, the proficiency level of the child, that child needed additional resources. And we wanted to make sure that we formulaically designed a structure that addressed the number of service hours depending on the need of the child. We will continue.
So that would be a complicated formula, being that each MLL student would not get the same amount because depending on what level of proficiency in the language they had.
Correct.
No. Yes. So straight new, not speaking the language, they would need more service than somebody who'd been here a year, let's say.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the service models depends on personnel certification also. So it's something that we're going to be monitoring carefully, because if we have somebody that's dually certified, then the ability to support that child will be less than if we have to get individuals that have different certifications and don't have dual certification. So it's something new that is being infused this year, and it's something that we're carefully monitoring, particularly because one of the things we want to make sure is for our multilingual learners, as well as our students receiving specialized services, is that they are fully acclimated and part of the school community, and that everybody in the community sees them as part of the whole. Because currently in the past, the way it was structured, it was being funded and programmed at the central level, not necessarily at the school level. And what we want to make sure is that as our school leaders, our SGCs, and other personnel are thinking about all of their students, that they're thinking about it not only in terms of programmatic needs, but also in terms of funding, because the funding drives the program in many ways. So next year, our goal is to then also incorporate specialized services into the SPB budget, so that students are not being treated, that are receiving services are not being treated as this separate entity from the rest of the population, but being seen as part of the whole, which is really important as we are building communities where kids, regardless of the services they need, feel included, and we're establishing inclusive learning environments for our children and families, regardless of what they need.
Okay, that makes sense, and that sounds good.
Lunda, I don't know if I missed anything out that you feel we need to add.
I have nothing more to add.
Okay.
Mary Ellen. Are there any other questions or discussion comments from the board? If not, I want to also thank Lunda for walking us through the process. It's not the most simple process, many moving pieces. One of the things that I appreciate about it is that when we see all these moving parts, it reminds us that there are so many stakeholders in this commitment to public education, and that as the board oversees the entire district, we rely very heavily on our individual SGCs to help us, as Dr. Estrella said, identify the unique needs of each learning community so that we can reach each child as effectively as possible. So I'm not sure if this is where we go into, is the next juncture?
Before we go into the next juncture, I'm going to ask Dr. Lemons to just give an overview before we transition, just so that our interpreters can translate this component before we move into the groups. Dr. Lemons?
Good evening, everybody. Superintendent, when you say an overview, is this just a brief overview of what we will be doing? It's not the full orientation of
No,
that.
no, just a brief summary.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Lemons. I'm the Executive Director of Partners for Educational Leadership, formerly the Connecticut Center for School Change. Many of you know us under our old moniker. In the conversation that will follow, which will happen in a different Zoom, under a different Zoom link, we will be engaging students, school governance councils in a conversation about the work of SGCs and in the work for deepening the engagement of parents through SGCs. So we'll talk a bit about the purpose and function of school governance councils. And then we will put people into small groups where they'll have the opportunity to talk through how the year has gone and get feedback on some big questions around family community engagement. We'll come back from that and we'll ask groups to give brief headline overviews of the conversation. And then hopefully there'll be an opportunity for some discussion between the board and the SGC members. That's the plan.
Thank you, Dr. Lemons. So Chairman Hostin, if you want to transition us to the next Zoom.
Yes, so just so everybody knows, we have to use a separate link so that we can use breakout rooms for that part of the discussion. And so if everybody can please now transition from this link to the second link, we'll see you over there in just about a minute. Thanks, everyone.